Serious, people that do autopsies, what's the weirdest thing that you have found that didn't have anything to do with the person's death? Elderly pensioner died alone in his home. Not suspicious at all. Small mobile phone, flip phone, found in his rectum. No explanation ever determined. Maybe he called it with a separate phone so it would vibrate. Other causes of death. Impending ones. Malignancies that weren't diagnosed. Hepatitis. Occult bleeding. Etc. Once found full-blown metastatic stomach cancer in a college kid that died in a bar fight that escalated. It was pretty remarkable. This happened to both my grandpa and my great-aunt. My grandpa had an aneurysm on his jugular that could have burst at any moment. My great-aunt had cancer that they only found on the autopsy. Pneumonia took them both first. While completing the post-autopsy repair for a gentleman, I found a plastic ladle tucked under the ribs. It was probably left by some poor autopsy technician who got yelled at for losing the good ladle. I offered to send it back to the coroner, but they never returned my calls. Pennies. Hundreds of pennies. Nearly $6 worth inside the skin all over the arms and legs. Deceased was a hermit. Lived alone. Ordered out for every meal. Apparently he'd been surgically implanting pennies in his skin for years. No fking clue why. My friend does this autopsies and he said that he found 24 screws in the large intestine of a 75-year-old woman. The weirdest part is she died of a heart attack while in the shower. There was no possible explanation other than she was suffering from pica. My father had to sit in on the autopsy of a 14-year-old boy who had overdosed on drugs. He said he watched undigested chocolate cake get removed from the boy's stomach. It stuck with him for a while. Fuck man. This brought me back memories from when a kid I sat next to in high school died from a nod. He was 14 too and it happened while he was in a Nuvu camp chat with his girlfriend. That's just horrible. Autopsies get worse than that. Wait till you see someone cut around a vagina and pull it out like a big tube sock. Then they cut it in half and splay it open so they can examine it. This reminds me of when my mom tried to OD and a nurse came out and told me they were trying to get all the M&Ms out of her lungs. An 88-year-old grandma died of carbon monoxide poisoning. During the autopsy we couldn't open the back of the cranium. After much drilling we realized that her cranium was around 3-4 cm thick all the way around, leaving her with the smallest brain on a grown woman I've ever seen. She was fully functioning and never seemed affected by it in the slightest. I've never seen anything like it since. Buddy told me he found a pair of dentures in someone's thigh. Didn't say a word to anyone about it for a couple years either. Should have at least returned the dentures to Lost and Found. Brain aneurysm in a late 20s girl. Had a tattoo directly above her pubic region that said stay off the grass. Only tattoo on her body. Also had a full-blown trichobazor. Same patient. We saved it. No history of mental health issues or seeking treatment for any mental health disorders. Just enjoyed eating her own hair. Running into the occasional penis pump implant was also a fun one. So, to be fair, I don't perform autopsies. But I did hear from a coroner about the autopsy of my uncle after he passed away. He was an alcoholic with cirrhosis and was pretty deep into the disease. He passed out drunk with a burning cigarette one day and ended up lighting the apartment building he lived in on fire, where he passed away. He was also a bit of a hoarder and had left weight equipment and other packages behind the door, making it almost impossible to enter. Had to be identified by his dental records. Maybe not the weirdest thing compared to some stories. But after the autopsy the coroner told us that it was probably the best way for him to go. His liver was failing so bad. He lived in constant pain. Couldn't stop drinking due to physical dependence. And he probably passed out due to the smoke and went rather peacefully. Compared to what he'd have experienced being alive for a few more months. They had to drain something like 50-70 pounds of fluid from him after death. Mostly liquor his failing liver couldn't process anymore. My aunt passed out drunk cooking or smoking or something. Whole apartment caught on fire. A random person on the street ran in and saved her. She survived but struggled most of her life with alcohol and drugs until she finally got sober and met and married a long-time sober former alcoholic and now addiction counselor. They were happy together for a while, but she passed at 55 or so from complications from her heavy drug and alcohol use. I am grateful for that random person on the street, otherwise she would have never been able to experience that later time of peace. When my dad was in med school, one of the cadavers he worked on had committed suicide via gunshot wound to the head. Turns out the cadaver was an opera singer in life who had just found out he had throat cancer. Poor bastard. At least he went out on his own terms before things got bad and he was unable to do what he enjoyed. A professor was explaining to us the brain's ability to compensate and said there was a case. I believe the person had died of old age. Of someone missing an entire hemisphere of the brain. In its place was one big tumor. There were no signs of symptoms of this throughout the patient's lifetime. This is the story of a friend of my dad. Once she got a cartel member with multiple gunshots from the Mexican Marines, which have the fame of being the most deadly soldiers in the world, and a good part of these bodies have to be picked up with shovels. So these autopsies are just plain formalities. Well, she found that guy she got had a butt plug in his ass. At least the guy died happy, I guess. I was volunteering at the coroner's office and the doc pulled a very large, intact avocado pit out of a man's stomach. We all kind of looked at it and went, huh. Cause of death was a heart attack. I hate that I'll never know if someone dared this man and he won something. Or if he went through life consuming avocados this way on the reg. I was an assistant back in the day and once a man who died in drive-by was brought in. When examined we found that he had coke in his ass. My forensic medicine lectures took place in the department's Museum of Oddities. There are plenty of interesting items on display. But one particularly strange display caught my eye. It was an unlabeled cardboard box with 20-ish thin metal bars 10 centimeters, around 4 inches, long. One of the pathologists explained that the random pieces of metal were actually spoon handles which were found in a young woman's stomach. The remaining portion of the spoons was melted away by stomach acid. The woman was a patient in a psychiatric hospital in the 50s 60s and evidently had a tendency to swallow spoons. But her unusual diet had nothing to do with her cause of death. Can't exactly remember what it was. On a more humorous note, the museum also features a variety of strange tattoos. My favorite was a tattoo on the left upper thigh of a soldier which read, Nur Fr Damon. I.E. Ladies only. Haven't done any, but have observed some during my internship. One was a case of suicide of a 25-something woman. And there was a month-old fetus in her uterus. Which made the reason for her suicide kind of obvious since this was Kerala, South India, where women aren't allowed sexual independence and a child out of wedlock is considered a sign of immorality. My auntie runs a funeral home and she's told me some weird in the field stories. One that I remember was something she'd heard through the grapevine about a guy who I guess had a bit of a sick sense of humor and ate a bunch of those dino pills, that little capsules that when left in water expand into sponge dinosaurs. So when they opened him up they found pills, hard booze and dinosaurs. My former neighbor was a coroner's assistant. She said that she once was working on a guy who'd been a carpenter. When she opened his face, there was 40 years worth of sawdust that was so heavily compacted into his nasal cavity that it was like a solid block. She started picking at it and it just kept coming and coming. Guy had no nasal function at all, it was all sawdust. I don't know what the guy died of, but I don't think it would have been a blocked nose. My friend who does autopsies found Barbie doll heads in the intestines of a 21-year-old woman. Yes, Barbie dolls. Ken dolls. Those stuff. Weird part is she died from COPD. Edit. It's possible to have COPD at 21. My friend said she smokes 2 packs a day, so that may be the probable cause. Not quite an autopsy, but a friend of mine was working as a coroner's assistant. They got a call for a middle-aged male that had died in his trailer. When they got there, they found a morbidly obese man, butt-ass naked, dead on his living room floor. They went to move the body, and to their shock, discovered another body. A little person was laying dead beneath the big man with his head stuck up the big man's ass. Big man had a heart attack from the pleasure and fell on the little man, killing him. Weirdest fucking twofer I've ever heard of. But there ya go. Incidental finding of a toothpick lodged in the small intestine. Wonder how much pain that person felt. My dad accidentally swallowed a toothpick that hadn't properly been removed from his food and it poked a hole in the lining of his stomach. He had awful stomach pain for months. Doctors thought it was stomach cancer until they finally discovered it. Well, sometimes I collect dead animals and roadkill in good and fresh state for studying and dissecting. Once I found a large intestinal worm inside a little puppy that was abandoned by the mother and left to die. I don't do autopsies. But after my great-grandfather died for some health reasons, can't remember what, they discovered that all his organs were reversed during the autopsy. Heart on the right side instead of the left, etc. Thing is, he had been in medical care many times for health issues. So either his doctors all his life didn't notice his reversed organs or never told him. One of the cadavers we learned from in med school had his sciatic nerve somehow passing through the middle of his piriformis muscle. It wasn't fused to the side of the muscle via scarring. It ran right through the middle of the muscle. His medical history was unknown, but we expected that sciatic nerve pain was probably on the list. I think of him when a patient doesn't respond to typical treatments for things. Sometimes people are built differently than everyone else and you have to think outside the box to figure out what's going on. Oh man. Okay, one time we had an autopsy on a guy who had died abroad whilst on holiday. He'd already had an autopsy in his country of death. He needed another autopsy in his home country before his death could be registered. So that was our job. He had been embalmed and repatriated to us. Obviously by the time we received his body, his brain had already been removed and dissected, and the skull sutured closed. My colleague reopened the skull as we weren't sure of autopsy procedures in the country of death. The skull cavity was stuffed with underpants. Once saw someone that had tons of sleeping medication on him/her. Drank a bottle of wine and drowned in a tiny pond. Every bucket is deeper. Police said it's a natural death and did not investigate. The person living with him/her opted for cremation. 4 weeks after the funeral the police called and said there was something off and they want to have a look at the body again. I thought someone is pranking me and told him to call the crematory. Half an hour later police called and the slightly disappointed voice told me it's already cremated and buried. I guess this guy was not related to Sherlock Holmes. I guess this is one of those jobs you forget people actually do. Never met one in real life. Never known someone who knows someone who is one or whatever. Closest I can think of is my cousin's ex-husband who's a firefighter. He told me some stories. He says he spends more time dealing with bodies than actually fighting fires. Dragging a car out the river with a body inside and the smell hits you. He said it's something primeval that takes over. A smell you just know in your core is wrong. And the gag reflex kicks in quicker than you think. I'm now wondering how people cope that do autopsies. How much smell there is. Hell, even how doctors pass the training. I'd imagine a lot of people do all the theoretical and then fail at the last few hurdles where actual blood is involved etc and they pass out or can't handle it. I was doing an autopsy of an old man who died due to kidney failure. Found out he didn't have any kidney. Undigested corn in the bowels. I was once in a mental health facility for only a short amount of time. And I met two women whose daughter passed away from a drug overdose and had been upset at her for selling her grandmother's necklace for what she thought was drugs. But when the autopsy came back it was found in her stomach. Apparently she was swallowing the same necklace for years and I can imagine why someone would do that. My uncle found a pearl in the forehead of the cadaver. It was oddly protruding like a bump or keloid. Turns out it was a pearl, no idea why it was there. My grandfather had very narrow arteries. They likened it to a child's arteries. He had no problems up until he dropped down dead with a widowmaker heart attack. Nothing to give it away, plus they didn't have the technology in those days to diagnose these things easily. My dad once did an autopsy on a young man. Young 20s. Died in a car crash. But found a needle with traces of heroin in his intestines. Must have eaten the damn thing. Edit, spelling. My boss, dentist, did a few autopsies, I think part of his residency. I don't remember. And the most bizarre thing he said was a woman who had crowns on every single tooth. Even as a dentist. You don't come across that very often. Her cause of death was falling overboard at sea, I believe. Something like that. 5 years ago, an autopsy I viewed, the patient was put down to have died from post-surgical complications from a colostomy. Infection lead to sepsis and ended with MOF. When they began the examination and look, they found some surgical tweezers left behind, which was attributed to being caused of the infection because of how tucked away they were. I am unaware of what happened afterwards, but it was definitely referred higher. Wish I could ask my dad. He was a coroner for 17 years and worked funeral homes for a long time also. From his late teens and then past his time as a prison guard for 20 years. I do remember a tale about a guy who weighed more than 1,000 pounds. Broke the gurney out of the house. Put him in a box truck. Broke the second gurney and had to get the fire department and a tow truck to hoist him on the heavy duty gurney to get him inside. Okay, so my oldest uncle used to do and he once told me that a man had like $2 worth of coins in his stomach. He said there was only 1/4 though. I'm not an autopsy person, but when my mother passed last year they found a sliver bracelet in her. I have no idea how. Oh, and for your information, that's not the cause of death. When I was a student I saw an autopsy of a man who had hung himself. When we checked the main arteries in the heart, he had a huge blockage. He was basically just about to have a huge heart attack, so probably would have died anyway. Sorry, pretty grim. I'm not doing it, but I'm Hunter, so ITH that will pass. So once I found an broken spear in rib of wild hog. Sorry, but I don't have any photos. They were on my old phone that broke. My Professor Stroy. Patient died in a heart attack. Found a huge ass liver fluke, nearly 11 mm. Poor fella. Also in my country, Bangladesh, liver fluke is very rare. I was doing an autopsy on a young woman and 3 dildos up her ass. She died of a drug overdose. I'm half impressed but also terrified by that amount. Late to the party. My wife worked at a morgue and they found a crap in a guy they pulled from a river. I was an autopsy assistant for a few years. I helped out a couple of pathologists with around 80 autopsies. Here are a few where we found unexpected items. Though only one was completely removed from the cause of death. Man had a broken down vehicle on a bridge in the winter. Semi-trailer jackknifed, hitting the brakes and took up the entire bridge as it skidded forward. The man jumped over the bridge to evade the semi, landing in a river creek. He quickly died of hypothermia. During the autopsy, it was discovered that he had small cell lung cancer. Maybe had 6 months to live. There was a tornado. And we normally wouldn't do an autopsy on an individual that was obviously killed via the tornado. However, this one gentleman was found dead after a tornado with zero trauma that could be seen on his body. When we opened him up, almost none of his organs were where they were supposed to be. Just mixed all kinds of up. No idea how he had no outward signs of trauma. This one I'll keep fairly vague due to it being part of a murder investigation at one point. Subject was getting autopsied as was procedure. The subject had particular wounds that looked to be the cause of death. Upon the performing of the autopsy, it became clear that we were very wrong about the method used to kill the victim. So much so that the entire scenario of the victims had to be rethought. I knew an ME who had a strange case about something that wasn't there when everyone thought there should be. A guy was found dead after neighbors reported a heated argument between him and his wife. He had a small puncture wound on his temple. Detectives thought she might have shot him with a small caliber pistol like a .22 because of the size of the hole and no exit wound. The problem was that after x-raying his whole body they couldn't find a bullet. They checked his head and then thought it might have traveled somewhere else. So started looking. The other problem is that repeated searches of the home failed to find the pistol. It was only a very smart detective, searching the wife's belongings for the nth time, that noticed that the stiletto heels of one of her pairs of shoes were very thin. Thin enough to have made the hole. Some blood swabs and testing later and they showed she had hit or kicked him in the side of the head with her shoe with enough force to puncture his skull and kill him. Overall, a very strange case but a happy ending for the police and the guy's family.